Welcome to our podcast series, 5 Questions, 5 Answers, in which we explore recent U.S. trade policies and U.S. trade rules that can affect thousands of companies. We have a goal in mind to help you, the listener, translate the legal into real-world business strategies. My name is Birgit Matthiesen. I'm the Director of North American Manufacturing here at ArentFox Schiff in Washington, D.C. I get the easy part. I get to ask the questions, and I get to choose the colleague or the guest I know will have the right answers for you. So in the next few minutes, I will ask 5 questions that reflect the concerns we've been hearing from business leaders, all who want to understand the rules, but they also need to mitigate their business risk while increasing their bottom line. So let's start. The year is 1863. The Civil War has been raging. Union and Confederate soldiers are facing each other on the battlefield, and Abraham Lincoln is the president. The U.S. Treasury are worried that the coffers are dwindling with the cost of that war. One reason for that steep incline of the costs is the president's realization that contractors and other businesses were maybe bilking the administration, selling inferior supplies with fraudulent claims and high price tags. The White House knew they needed to act. They did. Passed in March of that year, the False Claims Act was enacted and was soon known as Lincoln's Law. During the intervening years since then, the law has seen a number of ebbs and flows, including a number of important amendments passed by Congress that gave new teeth to its enforcement. But its core has remained intact. Authority to detect and penalize businesses found to have profited from doing business with the federal government, but via fraudulent product claims. Each administration has employed the FCA with vigorous enforcement, including this current White House. In fact, earlier this year, the Department of Justice announced that settlements and judgments stemming from civil court decisions exceeded $6.8 billion in just fiscal year 2025. That was the highest in a single year in the history of the legislation. Quote, stopping rampant fraud is a top priority, and this record-breaking year proves the False Claims Act remains one of the government's most powerful weapons against fraud, unquote, said then Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. He furthered, we will continue to aggressively deploy it to protect taxpayer dollars and hold all fraudsters accountable. Stop quote. Which brings us to this podcast. Well, what should business leaders know about the Act? What exactly is a false claim? And why is understanding the Act more important now in today's current enforcement-driven environment? So I welcome to the table 2 of my colleagues. Jackson Toof is a partner in our firm. He had served for over 20 years as a trial lawyer in the field of highly complex business litigation. In fact, Jackson oversees the complex litigation group in the D.C. office. Here, an interesting fact. In 2003, Jackson began his career as a lieutenant on active duty in the United States Navy Judge Advocates General Corps, stationed in the Washington's Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. So another interesting fact about this, during the Civil War, President Lincoln frequently visited the Washington Navy Yard. Primarily, I think, to escape the pressures of the White House. But he also tested new weaponry with Commander John Dahlgren at the time and found, quote, consolation and courage, unquote. The Navy Yard was crucial for Navy artillery production and was visited by President Lincoln on the day of his assassination. The second colleague is Mario Torrico. He's a senior associate in our international trade practice, and he served as an international attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade Administration, where he advised the ITA on the World Trade Organization's different trade agreements, and he has been and was an active member of the U.S. delegation to the WTO. I welcome you both.
Thank,
Jackson,
thank you for having us.
thank you. Jackson, let me start with you then. Can you give our listeners a brief overview of the False Claims Act, highlighting some of the more important provisions and perhaps explaining how, in fact, it works?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you again for having me on the podcast today. So, the Federal False Claims Act, which, as you noted at the outset, is something sometimes referred to as Lincoln's Law because it dates back to the Civil War era, is one of the federal government's most powerful tools for combating fraud. Now, the False Claims Act, or FCA, as it's commonly called, is found in the United States Code at 31 USC, sections 3729 through 3733. From a high level, the FCA is a whistleblower law that allows private citizens to sue any individuals, companies, or other entities that are defrauding the government and recover damages and penalties on the government's behalf. The statute provides whistleblowers with financial rewards as well as job protection against retaliation. So, at its core, right, the FCA makes it illegal to knowingly submit false claims for payment to the federal government or knowingly make false statements to avoid paying money owed to the government. And that word knowingly that I used twice is important. It doesn't just mean intentional fraud. Under the statute, it also covers situations where someone acts in deliberate ignorance or reckless disregard of the truth. So you don't get a free pass just because you didn't bother to check whether your submissions were accurate. To be clear, right, the FCA does not require specific intent to defraud the government. Within the FCA, there's also what is known as a reverse false claim, and I think it's important to mention this here. Reverse false claim liability arises where an entity or an individual avoids the payment of money that's due to the government. So, unlike traditional fraud where the government is tricked into paying money, this reverse claim involves failing to return or pay funds that are owed to the government. So, let me give you an example. If a company makes a false statement during the course of a government audit, that would reduce the amount of money it owes the government or fails to return an overpayment, that can be a reverse false claim. So it's not as if the government paid money it shouldn't have paid. It's that the entity or individual didn't pay what was actually owed to the government. So, briefly, right, there's a few key provisions I just think our audience should be aware of, and I'll try to cover them briefly. So, the first of the four that I'll cover is with regards to penalties. Under the False Claims Act, the penalties are steep. We're talking about treble damages. That's three times the amount of the government's loss, plus per claim civil penalties that currently range in the tens of thousands of dollars per violation. And when you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of import entries, for example, that numbers will add up fast. And Mario and I have both seen that happen. So, speaking of penalties, just for the audience is aware, the minimum False Claims Act penalty increased in 2025 from $13,946 to $14,308 per claim, and the maximum penalty increased from $27,894 to $28,619 per claim. Now, the second of the four that I'll cover briefly, and this really is what makes the FCA unique, is the QUITAM provision. And I've done this long enough to know it's pronounced QUITAM, not QUITAM. So I just make that point. But this allows private citizens, you, me, whoever, often called whistleblowers or relators, to file lawsuits on behalf of the government. Now, if the case is successful, the whistleblower can receive a percentage of the recovery, anywhere between 15 to 30%. And that's a huge financial incentive for employees or former employees, competitors, or former business partners to come forward. So companies really need to understand that the threat doesn't just come from government auditors. It can come from within their own ranks, either from current or former employees. The third of the four that I'll mention briefly is that the FCA's statute of limitations, it's not short. It generally requires that actions be brought within 6 years of the violation, although the period can actually extend up to 10 years uh, because you tack on some additional time at the end from when the government knew or should have known of the material facts. So it's 6 years, but companies and individuals should be aware that it can extend up to 10 years, where you can go back in time up to 10 years for potential violations of the FCA. And finally, the FCA includes an anti retaliation protection for whistleblowers, which means that if a company retaliates against someone who reports potential fraud, they're opening themselves up to a whole separate category of liability. So I'll just end with the bottom line here is that the FCA is designed to cast a wide net. And in the trade and customs context, which Mario will speak about in a moment, I hope, that net is getting wider and wider every day.
Thank you, Jackson. And speaking about international trade, as I mentioned, Mario Torrico is a partner in their international trade practice. And so my question to him is how does Customs and Border Protection Agency, what's their role in the FCA, Mario?
That's a great question, Bridget. And there is the intersection between the FCA and customs and imports specifically. And so the agency that's at the forefront and making sure that our import regulations are being enforced and followed is, of course, Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And they're at the front lines of enforcing the FCA whenever there's a violation, of course. But at a high level, every time goods are imported into the United States, the importer is essentially making a declaration to CBP. And those declarations come in the form of what are the goods, where the goods are coming from, how much they're worth, what is the goods tariff classification, is the good eligible for any free trade agreements, are the goods subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So essentially, those are statements made from the importer to a federal agency, CBP, and that's truly where the FCA comes into play here. So, if an importer, whether deliberately or through reckless disregard, undervalues goods, misclassifies the goods to lower the duties, falsely claims that the good is eligible for a free trade agreement or free treatment under a free trade agreement, or misrepresents the country of origin of those goods, that can all trigger FCA liability. And in fact, in recent reporting, we've seen a real increase in the number of cases that the DOJ has pursued just in 2025. It's been a record number of cases. And that's a result of increased coordination between the Department of Justice and CBP on these matters. So there's been a real shift in recent years where CBP isn't just issuing penalties through its own administrative processes, it's referring cases to DOJ for civil enforcement under the FCA, which, as Jackson mentioned before, brings in treble damages and penalties, as we just talked about. And for any of our listeners that follow our customs and trade newsletter, we continuously post on the FCA and recent cases. So that's a good source of information of recent cases and where we think the agency is going and the DOJ is going in terms of its enforcement efforts. And it's also worth noting that under our customs laws, there is a clear requirement that parties must exercise reasonable care when importing goods into the United States, and which involves ensuring that the goods are properly declared to CBP. And a failure to exercise reasonable care can lead to hefty civil penalties, which are typically based on levels of culpability. So that's negligence, gross negligence, and fraud. So the FCA essentially raises the stakes on that obligation. So where a company has might have once only faced a civil penalty by CBP, now they find themselves in a position where they might be facing a full blown FCA case in a federal court.
So for both of you, being in the crosshairs of the federal government, can't be a good signal for businesses with shareholders, investors, important customers. I would imagine that for companies searching for a competitive edge in the US marketplace, demonstrated compliance would be an important component of marketing strategy at the very least. And that non compliance might be a deal breaker, such as maybe a loss of a federal contract or an erosion of a corporate ban, let alone the fiscal vulnerabilities. Jackson, have I got that right?
You do. I mean, I think you're spot on in asking that question. And I think it sometimes gets lost in the legal weeds, right? The FCA isn't just a legal risk, it's a business risk. It's a reputational risk. And increasingly, as we've seen, it's a competitive risk. So let me unpack that just a little bit here. If you're a publicly traded company or you have a private equity investor group, an FCA investigation is really a nightmare scenario. It's the kind of thing that has to be disclosed. It can tank your stock price, for example. It can trigger shareholder litigation, and it can scare off potential acquirers if you're in the middle of a deal, let's say. Even if you ultimately settle or prevail, the cost of defense alone in these cases can be enormous, and the cloud of suspicion of just being accused or alleged to have violated the False Claims Act can hang over a company or an individual for years and years, right? And think about federal contracts. Under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is commonly referred to as FAR, contractors have an obligation to maintain certain compliance standards. An FCA violation can lead to potential suspension or debarment, meaning you're effectively locked out of doing business with the federal government. And for companies in the defense space, aerospace, pharmaceutical, healthcare, or tech sectors, that can be an existential threat. But here's the flip side in what I've seen. And this is where the real opportunity lies. Companies that can demonstrate a robust trade compliance program are increasingly using that as a competitive differentiator. Customers, particularly large institutional buyers and government agencies, want to do business with partners who have their house in order. We've seen that from the cases we've handled over the years. If you can show that you have strong internal controls, that you're conducting regular audits, that you've invested in compliance infrastructure, that's a clear selling point. It tells the market, it tells the industry that you take your obligations seriously. And it, more importantly, signals to regulators that if something does go wrong, it wasn't for lack of trying or sticking your head in the sand or turning a blind eye because you were proactive at the outset. So, you know, that requires businesses to be proactive on the front end. It may require some investment of capital funds at the front end to avoid having these very challenging and frankly much more costly issues on the back end. On the other hand, noncompliance is absolutely a deal breaker. For example, we've seen transactions fall apart during due diligence when the acquiring company discovers trade compliance gaps because nobody wants to inherit an FCA liability. So, yes, compliance isn't just about staying out of trouble, it's about positioning your company for growth and protecting your brand in a market where integrity really matters.
Mario, I have actually two questions for you because they're related. Can you give us an idea of generally what have been the weakest areas of compliance or where companies fall down on? And have they been in the areas of price or safety claims? And can you just comment briefly what can companies expect in the months ahead?
Those are really good questions, Bridget, and really important questions to think about as we see FC enforcement continue to grow, and an area certainly that will not subside in terms of enforcement. So, to answer your question about kind of the areas where we see the weakest areas of compliance from a customs perspective, is certainly pricing or valuation of goods. That's a big one, just because getting the declared value of imported goods right is more complicated than people realize. And that is complicated because sometimes there's transfer pricing issues between related parties. There's assists issues or royalties or selling commissions that really all affect the value of your declared good to customs. And if they're not properly accounted for, you've got a valuation problem. And undervaluation means underpaid duties. And this is exactly the kind of false claim that the government loves to pursue. And I might also add that, in recent years, given the plethora of new additional duties, such as Section 232 or 301, there might be more incentives for importers to see all options to mitigate their duties. And one of those options could be through valuation. And this is certainly a risk area, I think, for a lot of companies, as the DOJ has been historically pursuing cases against importers for under declared values. And it's something to keep in mind that the DOJ is monitoring your valuation, and if there's any big changes in that valuation, that could lead to inquiries by CBP. Another area that we see a weak spot in compliance, I think, is country of origin, and that's where importers are making errors and relating to the country of origin of that good. And these errors typically arise when there's a complex supply chain and that good is manufactured in third countries using parts and components from other countries, especially when those inputs involve China. And a lot of times, importers think that because they exported the good from Thailand, that's the country of origin, but that's most times not correct. I mean, if you have a lot of inputs coming from China, for example, and they're very high value and very complex, and they really give a lot of essence to the character of that good, that those are triggers that, Thailand or Vietnam or whatever third country you're declaring is probably not the country of origin. It's probably China in those instances. So it's really important, I think, for importers to truly make honest assessments on what the correct country of origin of that good is, and ensuring that they use the right legal test and frameworks to get there. And that's, of course, substantial transformation, which at a high level involves assessing whether the product underwent a process that resulted in a new name, character, and use for that product. Another area that we see a lot of weak compliance is the failure to remit anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And this is truly an area where I think companies and importers specifically need to beef up their compliance efforts, just because nowadays there's hundreds of ADCVD orders, many of which carry very, very hefty ADCVD duties. And the failure to pay these can quickly run up tariff underpayments and again expose you to a higher FCA penalty action. And typically, where we see scenarios where importers get in trouble with AD/CVD compliance is when there's transshipment of goods, specifically when there's goods being transshipped from China to a third country, and in that third country they undergo very light manufacturing and then exported to the United States. And this is to sort of disguise the true origin of the goods. But customs is paying attention. They're issuing inquiries as to what is happening in that third country to make sure that, despite it being lightly manufactured there, their position is the AD/CVD duties continue to apply. And I think finally, an area where I think by far there's been most enforcement action in an area where there's a real lack of compliance sometimes is getting the HTS classification right for companies. And as I mentioned before, the HTS classification many years ago might have been not that important for companies, but as our trade policy and laws and rules have changed, especially during Trump's first administration, and now we're in his full blown second administration, and with the imposition of these new additional duties under 232 and 301, and because a lot of these additional duties are really driven by the HTS code, it's important for importers to do a lot of that diligence to make sure, is my HTS classification right? Because that itself is triggering these additional duties. So a misclassification can result in underpayment of duties that can range anywhere from 7.5% to 100%. And then you add on, AD/CVD compliance and all these other, factors, and you're looking at really hefty FCA penalty actions. And I think a lot of that you can see through enforcement actions just last year, where you have settlements well in the millions of dollars for a lot of these importers. And they're not only small, they're not only big importers, they're very small importers as well. So everyone is on the hook here. And I don't think anyone is safe from FCA liability and compliance and CBP enforcement efforts as well.
So, Jackson, jump in here with Mario. That's a question for both of you. This podcast has been an eye opener. So, given what you shared with our listeners, how does ArentFox Schiff help? What assistance can you provide to companies?
Absolutely. Happy to jump in. I think when issues are identified, whether through an internal audit or because the company has received a request for information from CBP or a subpoena from DOJ, we help clients navigate that response, right? And it can include conducting internal investigations, preparing and filing prior disclosures with CBP, representing companies in enforcement proceedings. The goal here is always to mitigate exposure as much as we can and demonstrate to the government the company is acting in good faith. I'll just mention that, we have a deep experience in the KETAM defense work. I've been doing KETAM defense work for, almost 2 decades now. If a whistleblower has filed a complaint, there's a very specific process that plays out, and engaging counsel who understands the FCA litigation landscape early in the process is critical. And we try to work with our clients to develop their defense strategy. Then we engage constructively with DOJ during the investigative stage. And if necessary, of course, we'll litigate these cases through to resolution. Mario may have some other eh, thoughts on how AFS can help.
Yeah, certainly. And I'll just add that we don't work in a vacuum here. I think our customs and international trade attorneys collaborate closely with colleagues across the firm. That's white collar defense, government contracts, corporate compliance, to make sure we're addressing the full picture and making sure we're issue spotting a host of issues that are not only relevant to trade, but are relevant to other areas as well. And I think this podcast is a good example where Jackson is in the litigation group, and I'm in the international trade group. And Jackson and I have worked together on several customs fraud cases over the years, and we've worked together on many customs litigation cases. So I've learned so much from Jackson from a litigation perspective, and I think Jackson has learned a lot. I hope he has from a customs perspective, and on how customs not only enforces our laws but thinks about in working together, Jack and I working together on strategies on creating the best defense possible for our clients and hoping to get the best possible outcome as well.
Yeah, I would just say I have learned, some of the custom side from Mario. So I think the synergy between our two disciplines is really works well when you approaching the government using FCA in connection with customs, fraud cases. And really, this is where Aaron Fox Schiff lives and breathes, right? It's our trade and customs team, and now with the litigation group, works with importers every day on exactly the issues we've been discussing on this podcast. And I really think we take a full spectrum approach. So really, the bottom line is whether you're looking to strengthen your compliance program, respond to a government inquiry, or defend against an FCA action. Aaron Fox Schiff has the experience and the team to help companies or individuals navigate it. And of course, we'd welcome the chance to talk with any of the listeners of this podcast about how we can best support their business and their brands. I thank you for inviting me on this podcast today.
Well, listen, both of you, thank you very much for the time you've taken with our listeners. As I said, this podcast has been an eye-opener and very interesting, especially during these times. For our listeners, if you feel that you want to speak to either Jackson or Mario, let me give you their email addresses very, very quickly. It's Jackson.Toof, and that is spelled TOOF as in Frank. So Jackson Toof at afslaw.com, and Mario.Torrico, and that is spelled Torrico, Mario Torrico at afslaw.com. And of course, the DC office number is 202-857-6000. Again, gentlemen, thank you very, very much. And I hope I get to entice you back on to a future podcast with me in the very near future.
Anytime, would love to join you again.
Thank you for having us.